You are listening to the Book of Mormon, History and Geography. This is a brand new podcast, and as the name implies, we will go into topics pertaining to the history and geography found in the Book of Mormon. My name is Carlin Smith, and I'm sitting down with my father, Troy J. Smith. And Troy is a published author and longtime Book of Mormon scholar. And Troy has a BA from Tulane University in Latin American Studies, with a primary focus on Mesoamerican archaeology. How are you doing, Troy?
I'm doing great.
So you have had a couple of books published at this point. The first book was in 2016, The War Against Christianity. And you have another book that's coming out in the next month. It's called The Gadianton Robbers. So how does it feel to be a published author? I know it's been a few years already since your first published book.
It's actually quite uplifting. Being an author was not my goal when I joined the church. I was simply searching for truth and reason, and joining the church was actually part of that search. I soon learned that there was a lot of confusion surrounding Book of Mormon geography, and from the beginning I viewed the Book of Mormon geography as being hemispheric in scope. That was actually the perspective of Michael Hobby, who introduced me to the church and who baptized me. And at that time, I committed to join him in a life of study along those lines. Initially, the focus was upon geography, and all the studies of the Book of Mormon that we undertook were viewed in connection with that underlying idea. And then in the year 2000, I began to focus more upon the history of the Book of Mormon. I looked closely at every event in the Nephite journey. I must admit that my ultimate goal was still the geography of the Book of Mormon. But as the study has continued, it became much more, and I've learned so much more than geography. Being an author is very exciting because it enables me to share the things that I've learned about the Book of Mormon with members of the church throughout the world.
So the geography, though, is sort of I wouldn't want to call it an afterthought, but it wasn't the primary focus of your first book. Is that right? The War Against Christianity?
No, it wasn't. It has been the primary focus from the beginning of what I'm doing, but I decided in the year 2000 that I needed to focus first and foremost upon the Book of Mormon as a history and let the geography sit on top of the history.
So going back to the geography, what sets your model? Now, this model has been around for quite a while. The basis of the model, you can find information on it. It was first, the first date you can find for it is in 88. Is that right? And it was known as the Hobby-Smith model.
Yes, it was first established by Michael Hobby and myself. And we did some articles in a magazine that we called the Zarahemla Quarterly, and we did a lot of articles, and in those articles we laid out the geography, and those articles those issues are not available except some that I have privately, but if there's ever a desire, they could be reprinted again.
Okay. Now, I really enjoyed your first book. It helped me personally visualize the events in the Book of Mormon, and it suddenly became so much more real and seemed like I was able to connect to the Book of Mormon on a more personal level. It's sort of I found it to be kind of a commentary, but infused with invaluable insights into the history. And you also go over, like we said, the geography in the Book of Mormon, and this model that you've been working on for 30 years. You have maps in your first book, and they actually place these the Book of Mormon cities in real world locations. Is that right?
Yes. And during that period of the Book of Mormon, the Nephites were located exclusively within the land southward, which I label as South America.
Okay, so yeah, we'll go into the geographic model a little more, but just real quick on your second book that's coming out, The Gadianton Robbers. The topic of Gadianton Robbers might be very interesting to a lot of Latter-day Saints, especially right now with a lot of things that are going on. We probably don't know a lot of the things that are going on behind the scenes of government and all this, but is it possible that a lot of the themes or some of the things that we see with the Gadianton Robbers in the Book of Mormon, is that something that may be going on today?
I believe that it truly is going on today, just as the Gadianton Robbers were secretive in everything they did. I truly believe that a lot of what's happening in the world today, and especially within the United States, we can't see the foundation of what's happening because it's
Very nebulous, and
it's
that's by design.
and by design secretive. Yes,
Very interesting. Now, you don't make any comparisons between what's going on today with the Gadianton Robbers from the Book of Mormon, but the reader a reader of your book would be able to see the patterns of the Gadianton Robbers and perhaps apply those patterns or compare those patterns to what's going on today.
that's very well said. That would be a study within itself, and that would require a different book. And
That doesn't interest you that much.
I don't have the inclination to do that, so I actually leave it up to the reader to make those comparisons themselves, and we'll see it more and more as things develop as we near the second coming.
But you do offer a lot of insights, I'm sure. I have not read your second book yet. I will as soon as I grab a copy. But yeah, I'm excited to see what you have written in there. And you also go over geography, additional points of geography in that second book.
I do, but only as it related to well, I do a review of book one in a sense because I lay out the basic geography once more. It's summarizing the geography of the pre-Christ period. And then I go into the Gadianton Robbers and where they were, where they lived, where they operated, and the place of gathering when the Nephites gathered to fight against the robbers in the War of Gadianton.
So most models that I've seen, they have just a big comprehensive map where all these different locations took place. The maps that you have in your first book and now in the second book, they are simply a representation of the geography that the Nephites understood or knew about at that time up until what was the year you gave?
BC? 55 BC, so when the northward migrations began.
Okay, so 55 BC. So the geography that you lay out in the first two books is the geography that the Nephites knew and understood up until 55 BC. And all of those, one thing that the listeners might find interesting is the idea that the model that Michael Hobby and you came up with as early as the mid 1980s, what is a hemispheric model. The interesting thing, though, is that the hemispheric models is something that Book of Mormon scholars and academics have strayed away from since then. Is that right?
Totally and completely. Until then, primarily the hemispheric was the only model. And actually, it started changing long before that, maybe the 50s or even earlier. But the majority of the people in the church were still hemispheric in scope, including the leaders.
And hemispheric, for those listening that aren't familiar with the term, is the idea that hemispheric means the entire Western Hemisphere from North America down to South America, that the events took place spanning that entire region. You have other models today. You have the limited Tehuantepec model. You also have the Mesoamerica model. I'm not sure if those two are the same thing.
Probably they're the same. There are several different ones.
The Heartland model, you have the Malay model. Yeah, then you have the Baja California model. All of these more modern models are limited in scope, and they're considered limited models because they take place in limited areas. And so the idea that the events of the Book of Mormon took place in these isolated areas nestled in between all of these great civilizations, and they never mentioned any of these great civilizations is kind of interesting to think about.
I agree.
Now, your model, the major cultures found in the Americas are actually the major cultures of the Book of Mormon.
Yes. If you believe in a hemispheric, or if it is hemispheric, then all of the great cultures of the Western Hemisphere were Book of Mormon cultures.
And that includes the Aztec, the
Aztecs,
Maya.
the Incas, the Maya, Olmec, actually, perhaps not the Olmec. The Olmec preceded the Maya.
But you do have an inclination of who the Olmec were.
Oh, I totally do.
But you don't want to go into it yet.
No, that will be in a future book.
Okay. We're excited for that one. Yeah. So it seems like modern academics of the Book of Mormon start with conventional archaeology and geography as the basis of their models. And then they try to fit the Book of Mormon context into that. Is that right?
I think most of them are conventional archaeologists, and that's one of the reasons why it can't be hemispheric in scope in their perspective.
Now, with your model, though, you're taking the information found in the Book of Mormon, and you start with that as your base, and then you take all of the conventional archaeology, all that information, and see how that can fit into your model.
Yeah, that will be the subject of the fourth book. I will correlate all of the major cultures, all the major civilizations of the Western Hemisphere, and they all fit, a one-to-one correlation between each one of them.
Very interesting. You said that there may be points of contention. Do you shy away from the scrutiny, or do you welcome the scrutiny, but you just don't want to? How does that work for you?
I'm not afraid at all of the scrutiny. I just don't like contention.
So you've been working on this for 35 plus years?
44 years.
44 years. So there's a lot of background with what you're doing. You didn't just one day decide that you were going to write a book and sit down and start typing.
No, I had been publishing articles in the Zarahemla Quarterly for only a couple of years, but I had been thinking about it for a long, long time. And then I realized that the Book of Mormon had to be the foundation of everything, and that's when I went to the Book of Mormon, beginning with the very beginning and continuing on throughout the entire Book of Mormon. And it will be presented in 3 books, the second of which is coming out in July.
So 3 books, but I heard you mention a 4th book.
There is a 4th one.
How many books do you have planned here?
Those 4, and I've already written another one that may be published someday. It's on the kings of Israel. I went through all of the kings in both Judah and the 10 tribes, and that'll be another subject. And
Is that pertinent to what you're doing here?
It was preparatory to the 600 BC departure of the Nephites.
So it was a background to that.
It was a background to it, and Zedekiah was the king when his son Mulek came over across the ocean shortly after the Nephites, and so I go through Zedekiah.
So he had a son Mulek, but Mulek was not part of the Jewish record.
He's not in the Bible, and no one even knew about him because he
was kept secret.
Because his brothers had all been killed in front of their father, and so they couldn't let anyone know that he lived, and yet he did, and he came with others, a group that were his supporters and probably family, and they came across the ocean and landed in the land northward, whereas the Nephites, or the Lehites, had landed in the land southward.
Well, it's very interesting because in the Book of Mormon, where Nephi is talking to his brothers, Laman and Lemuel, and he's testifying to them that what they're doing is correct, and he tells them that there will be a time that they come to know that Jerusalem was destroyed, and that was fulfilled.
I think I actually covered that in the first book.
Oh, you did cover that. Okay, so that's where I got that little...
Yeah, because Mulek was the proof. They lived 400 years before they even learned about Mulek. It was when Mosiah led the people out of Nephi into the
So they were fleeing from the Lamanites once again. There was this civilization of Jaredites that was alive and I don't want to say thriving when the Nephites landed, when Nephi and his Lehi landed in the Promised Land.
They were thriving in the land north.
So they were thriving, but they did not know about this civilization up north, because where Lehi and his family landed was a hunting preserve, and they didn't venture that far down south. Is that right?
They never did.
The Jaredites didn't venture south.
It was a very large wilderness, and I talk about that in Book 1 as well, where the Nephites were afraid to move into it very far. They would get lost, and they did that for years and years. And the Jaredites probably had the same thing going on the other side of it, where they would come down into the land southward, and they probably never ventured all the way through that wilderness.
Well, you had to be one of the elite to even go into the hunting reserve, right? I mean, it was probably the king and his family, and people that were allowed to go down there.
People that were part of his hunting parties and are certainly part of the elites, as you call them.
And they probably didn't know how big that land down there was, I imagine.
They may have never known, and it's possible that someone ran into them, but it certainly never became knowledge or general knowledge to the Nephites.
Yeah, very interesting. So the Jaredites were thriving as the Nephites landed. And then shortly, how many years later did the Mulekites land?
For probably, I consider it to be somewhere between 10 years to 20, perhaps.
Okay.
Maybe less, because they left immediately. Lehi left immediately before the Babylonian captivity, and the Mulekites left immediately after. So it could have been as little as 3 or 4 years between them. We don't know.
So the Mulekites landed. And they landed in the middle of this Jaredite civilization. The Jaredites allowed them a place to stay, to live, and start a city and whatnot.
Right. The city of Moron, the Jaredite capital of Moron, was at the very edge of Jaredite lands.
On the south.
On the south. And the Mulekites were in what they called later the land of desolation. And but it was right next to the Jaredites, which is why the Mulekites could discover Coriantumr when he came back from the Great Destruction.
But when the Mulekites were there living south of the Jaredites, they picked up Jaredite culture, they picked up Jaredite religion.
So completely. It was only within the Jaredite nation. And so the Mulekites, who did never become a part of the Jaredite nation, they witnessed it from the neighboring land of desolation. They didn't call it desolation at that time, and we have no idea what they called it, but they were able to witness it. But because they weren't part of that contention, part of the struggle, they weren't drawn in because they weren't trying to. They were separate people, and so as the war raged across the face of the land, I'm sure they were able to witness it in various ways. But then the battles moved northward all the way to the hill Ramah, which was later the hill Cumorah, and all that was left was bodies strewn across the entire face of the land.
And it was at that point that the Mulekites moved south into this hunting reserve.
Not immediately, but after Coriantumr went down, the war was over. He went down and was discovered by the Mulekites and lived with them for 9 months. After Coriantumr died, that is when they would move down. They left desolation because for the very reason that they called it desolation, it was cursed. It was cursed. There were dead bodies in the neighboring land, and the stench of those things not only troubled the Jaredites, but it also troubled the Mulekites, and even afterward. And the Lord had sent great droughts upon the land, and the disease and pestilence from all the dead and rotting bodies. You can imagine it became a totally
so they fled all that
inhabitable land,
moved down into the land southward.
Yeah,
and they took elements of the Jaredite culture with them, though religion, politics, maybe.
That's the bad part. Is they brought the Order of Nehor with them, and you might think that Nehor established his religion in the first year of Alma's reign, but they found when Ammon and actually Aaron, one of the four sons of Mosiah, when they went into the land of the Lamanites, they found an Amalekite temple, which was after the order of Nehor. And so that preceded Nehor, but he took the name, he was named Nehor, and he established the same religion, but I think he followed the pattern set by the Christians, by Alma, when he established the church. He decided, wow, that works really well. I'll establish my own church and implement this religion which had been around, which destroyed the Jaredites.
You were saying earlier that Mosiah took his people up, fleeing Nephi. They had established their civilization in this land of Nephi, and the Lamanites eventually caught up with them, and so they had to flee again. And they moved up and were just aimlessly wandering through the jungles, and ended up coming upon these Mulekites that had fled down from the Jaredites.
On the Sidon River.
On the Sidon River, where they eventually established Zarahemla, or it may have been established there already in some form.
Well, there were no other cities, and I'm not sure it was a city at that time. I think it was a gathering place where they had arrived not long before the Nephites. Certainly they weren't there very long, or they would have, being larger in number than the Nephites, they would have already established more than one city. Just like in the land of Nephi, the Nephites had at least 2 and maybe 3 cities for sure, and that's the only ones that are a part of the record. And there may have been more, but there were none other. And the wilderness of Hermounts was right there. If you look at the first battle with the Amlicites, you see that there was wilderness. It was called the wilderness of Hermounts. It was immediately west and north of the city of Zarahemla. There was no spreading out over the land, and so I do not believe the Mulekites were there already.
There's a lot of people who believe that having an idea of where these events took place in the Book of Mormon doesn't add any value to understanding what's going on. And I'm sure you've come across that sentiment before.
Yes, and it doesn't if all you're doing is looking at the Word of God at the Book of Mormon as the Word of God,
which you certainly can do, and you get a lot out of it.
Oh, absolutely! It is so full of Scripture, prophecy, the story of Christ visiting them, all of the things contained in the small place of Nephi, which preceded the Book of Mosiah. And there's just so much in prophecy that we can utilize today. And I will go into that in Book 3, where I focus on the appearance of Jesus Christ to the Nephites. And not only do I focus upon his visit, but I also go back to Nephi, the first Nephi, the son of Lehi, and to talk about all the prophecies they gave, and other prophecies that were given by Nephites, including those given by a Mormon and the Savior himself, and they all mirror one another, and it is so powerful. And so this book is not just a book of history and geography. The third book especially will cover a lot of Scripture and do it in a way that just guides the reader through. To me, it will be the most powerful of the 3 books because of the visitation of Jesus Christ.
Is having a desire to know where these things took place the same as trying to use physical evidence to prove the veracity of the Book of Mormon? Or, I mean, you take a look at the Bible. We know where a lot of these events took place that happen in the Bible. And
I know what you're saying. Israel, we know exactly where Jerusalem is. We know all the neighboring countries, especially Egypt, that caused them all kinds of problems throughout their history. They were fleeing from Egypt when they arrived in Jerusalem or in the land of Israel. And so, yeah, that's a very important part of the Bible. And though we can use the Book of Mormon as a spiritual guide and a way to draw closer to God, it could actually be the starting point for some, especially those that don't know anything about it. But if you could establish a correlation between the archaeological record and the Book of Mormon, it would be the beginning point for some people who otherwise wouldn't give it a second thought.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. And if you express that sentiment, there are those that may scorn you for believing that it could be a starting point for some people.
Right. I know it will be there may be derision from some. It's from people outside the church, but I'm not worried about the limited theories of geography, because I don't think they're borne out by anything. They can't even find a narrow neck of land unless they contort it into something that it's not.
Well, let's talk about some of the elements in your model that I think are pretty interesting. One is the narrow neck of land. Now, the Nephites, they had this idea of the land that they lived in, and it seems to me as though they viewed their land the same way as we do it in modern times. You have the land northward, which we know is North America. They had the land southward, which we know is South America. And so it doesn't seem like a big stretch to imagine that they viewed it the exact same way that we view it.
Absolutely. That's why it makes so much sense to take Mormons' words and liken them to our own world that we live in. They described it exactly as we do, like you said. And
well, you also, so the narrow neck of land then would become the land that joins North and South America.
Right. It's so simple, isn't it? It's so simple as to be almost impossible to understand if you start somewhere else. But if you'll start with the hemispheric and really look closely at it, instead of taking a few thoughts from conventional archaeologists and coming to the conclusions before you even look at it that it's not true, then, I mean, if you really focus on it and proceed all the way through the entire idea, then I don't know how you can come up with any other thing, especially when you know that the apostles and the early leaders of the church all believed it was hemispheric, and that it goes all the way through Spencer W. Kimball. And
now it's really interesting when you think about that, though. They publicly talked about these things being hemispheric, meaning they took place over all of North and South America. There was a point, though, when they completely silenced themselves. They stopped talking about the geography completely, and that's when did that happen?
Well, Spencer W. Kimball was one of the last. Bruce R. McConkie, who lived at the same time, he was also one who believed that Valparaiso was the landing place. He's the last one that I've seen.
Now, for those listening, Valparaiso is in Chile. And how did that come about, the Valparaiso?
Well, Joseph told one of the early leaders, that's the only quote that actually links it directly to Joseph Smith, told them that the Lehites, Lehi and his people, landed on the coast of Chile. And the other later prophets added to that by pinpointing it, and I don't believe they did that on their own. I believe that also came from Joseph Smith. I don't think anybody would focus on a specific city. However, Bruce R. McConkie did receive some revelation when standing on the coast at Valparaiso that it was the landing place, and he considered it to be holy ground. But after them, nobody talks about it.
So they didn't just jump on board with any of these limited models. They just completely
went silent.
They
went silent.
That's kind of interesting that they would just go silent.
Now, well, you don't want to talk about something that's controversial, and if you have people in science that are going to dispute everything you say and refute everything you say about it, then because the Book of Mormon is so important spiritually, we don't have to dwell on the geography, and I don't think that could be done within the leadership of the church. And then you have someone like me, who's not tied to the leadership of the church. People are going to look at me on the side as just some misled person, but I don't mind, because
you're not speaking for the church.
I'm not speaking for the church. I'm speaking logically.
And if they were to speak against you, it's not going to reflect that on the church, like you're anti-science or anti-conventional wisdom. And so I think it was kind of smart of the leaders to just go silent about it. We don't need to talk about this. The more important thing is the spiritual aspect of the Book of Mormon, but when you start examining the underlying history within the Book of Mormon, you can extract all of these different ideas and begin to pinpoint where things took place. And if you start with that as your base, and apply the archaeological record to that base, it seems like a more perfect equation to me to do it that way. Now, the idea that they landed in Chile, Lehi and his family, that is usually discounted by Book of Mormon academics because it was secondhand account, and so we can't really trust it. But it came as a secondhand account from apostles and prophets, though, which is very interesting. So are they going to lie and say that Joseph Smith told him these things and it didn't really happen? And multiple apostles and prophets made the claim that he had told them these things. And so it's interesting that people will just automatically discount that because it's a secondhand account.
Right. Only one actually mentioned Joseph Smith, which I've never heard mentioned by anyone. As a matter of fact, what I get from the literature that I see is that he never told anyone, that it didn't come from him. And then I found a quote from one of the leaders of the church after Joseph, who had lived when Joseph was there, who actually came across from England the year before Joseph died.
So he talked with Joseph?
And he talked with Joseph, and that's what he said. So I can't discount what the leaders since him have said, and I believe that this man was not the only one, because others among them had known the prophet Joseph Smith.
They're interesting stuff. Now, also, one idea, you mentioned this in your first book, it's the narrow strip of wilderness, and we've talked about this before, and it's interesting, the idea of the narrow strip wilderness. When I was a kid, I would think to myself, what could this possibly mean? And in my little kid brain, I thought that the narrow strip of wilderness was just a narrow strip of jungle, and there was no an empty land or desert above it and a desert below it. And to me, that was what the narrow strip of wilderness was. And it's interesting to think about because a lot of Book of Mormon academics don't know what to do with that. What is the narrow strip of wilderness? What could that possibly mean?
If it was in a desert, you would think, it's probably a river, because if you look along rivers in a desert, that's where the trees are. But this, by using the Hemispheric Model, the place where the Nephites would have lived would have been in the jungles of the Amazon and to the north of it. And therefore, it is going to be all wilderness. It's going to be all jungle. And
so then when you then try to place this narrow strip of wilderness, I mean, was that a puzzle for you guys at the beginning, you and Michael, as you were trying to determine what?
Michael and I never got to this point, because it was only when I was studying the Book of Mormon
the idea came to you.
That the idea came to me as I went through the Book of Mormon, and ran into these verses. I knew that they had left Nephi and had fled eastward to Zarahemla. The geography is all there. Yeah. And therefore I had to find something that they would be able to do. And of course I looked at the map, and I saw that the Amazon River, and actually all the rivers to the north are separated from the Amazon, except for just a very few, couple of 100 miles to the west of Zarahemla. there's
For those of us that have not read the book, though, explain to us the concept of the narrow strip of wilderness.
they would utilize that narrow strip of wilderness to go from one place to another.
It was sort of like a marker or a highway or they used it as a means of travel.
As a means of travel. Now, you don't see that. There are only 2 verses that really talk about that, and one is found in the 22nd chapter of Alma, and the other one is found just a little bit later. I can't remember the exact chapter at this moment, but I could find
You're
it very,
getting
very
old.
quickly. Yeah, I'm getting old. Well, I haven't been focused on that. I've been focused on the Gadianton Robbers recently.
That's true.
And so some of the things go a little dim.
But the narrow strip of wilderness, you have two hydrological divides. Is that the right word?
One hydrological divide separating the rivers to the north from the Amazon River.
So 2 water basins that have a divide. So we have one of these in the United States. It's the Continental Divide. Every river to the west of that either flows south or west into the Pacific, and then everything east of that flows south or east
into the Atlantic and the Gulf of Mexico.
And so you have the exact same thing that sits between the Nephite lands and the Lamanite lands. And so if you're walking along that narrow strip of wilderness, if you come across a river and that river is flowing north, you know you're in Nephite lands. If that river is flowing south, you know you're in Lamanite lands. And the closer you are to that divide, now there's gonna be mountain peaks and stuff, so you're not gonna be able to go up and down these mountain peaks. But if the closer you are to that divide, the less wide those rivers and streams are gonna be, and so just by looking at the direction that water is flowing, you know whose lands you're in.
You flow, and you always go upstream to get to that divide.
Yeah, if you find yourself straying away from that divide, you just go upstream, and it takes you close, and the water becomes easier to pass. You might just be stepping over these little streams at that point.
Yeah, and so as you're moving, any river you divide will put you back on course simply by going to its source.
So if you're Moroni or Mormon, or Alma, how do you describe that? How would you describe that divide that goes from one side of the continent all the way to the other? The way they just actually describe that, actually running from the East Sea to the West Sea, or West Sea to the East Sea. And so how would you describe that if you were them? I mean, there's no easy way to describe that. I mean, it took us quite a bit just now to lay all of that out.
Yeah, it was a narrow strip of wilderness. That's how they called it. Now, the other place, and you'll have to go to Book 1 to see that, the war against Christianity. But the way they describe it in one place is they entered the wilderness that separated Zarahemla from the land of Nephi, and
sort of like
came over to the land of Manti, and that's when the 4 sons of Mosiah brought those Lamanites that had been converted to the gospel with them, and they left them in the narrow strip of wilderness into the wilderness to the south of Manti, while they went up to get permission to let them move into the land of Jershon, which was on the east. Yeah. And I have a map in the book that shows exactly where they went, where they stopped, where they waited to get permission, and then their second journey.
Now, these maps are also on your website.
Not those. These are in the book 2.
Oh, book 2. Okay, they're not on the website yet.
No, I did a summary of some of the events of the first book, and I placed them in the second book. And it's so that you can see the geography in terms of events before you go into the Gadianton Robbers and all of the things that happened in their life.
So I think we're going to wrap things up here. Now, for those interested in purchasing a copy of your first book, The War Against Christianity, where can they find that currently?
You can find it at Cedar Fort. Just go onto the Cedar Fort site, and they'll have that book as one of many listed. But you can also go.
Now, I saw it on Amazon. I saw it on Amazon, and you can also purchase it as a Kindle download.
Yeah, and to get more information, you can go to my site at troyjsmith.wordpress.com. And I have a link to that site, and that's probably the simplest if you just go to that site.
troyjsmith.wordpress.com. Okay, and also for your next book, how do they reserve? Can they reserve a copy or pre-order it?
You can pre-order it directly from
Cedar Fort.
Cedar Fort.
Okay. So yeah, you can just do a little Google search, find Cedar Fort's website, and they have it listed and available for pre-purchase. And that comes out. Do you know the exact date?
No, July, and I think they're pushing to try to get it out at the beginning of July.
Beginning of July, possibly, but it's completely up to the publisher when they decide to go live with it. There's no hard date yet at this point.
There's no hard date.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure, and we plan to do some more of these episodes here coming up. We plan to get to know Troy a little more, go into his background, and talk about things that happened in his life, his conversion, the story of Michael Hobby, and Troy's education, and we'll also later dive more into the Book of Mormon geography and really go into your model and look at what makes your model unique and the very interesting aspects of your model. And
there are some verifications in book 2 that it's that really verify that it is the correct geography, and that's in the names of certain rivers.
Real world names of real rivers.
Present day names of rivers.
Okay. We look forward to that for sure. Yeah. Yep. We're done. That's it.